Hi, I'm Isabella Steger with the Wall Street Journal, and you are with our Google Hangout now on the Wall Street Journal Digital Network. It is June the 4th, and we are here to discuss the 25th anniversary of what happened in Beijing in Tiananmen Square in June 4th, 1989. I'm joined by two reporters in Hong Kong, Josh Chin, who's usually with us in Beijing, Adam Najberg, who is our digital editor for Asia, but he was a freelancer for the Washington Post in Beijing at the time of the protest, and Adi Ignatius, who was our bureau chief in Beijing during that time as well. Welcome all, and we're going to go straight into the first question. The first one is from Akash Gupta in New Delhi from Twitter, who asks, what grievances triggered the Tiananmen protests, and were they subsequently addressed? Adam, I'm going to throw that first one to you.
Izzy, thanks. So already in the winter, before the spring protests, there was unrest on Chinese college campuses. It had to do at that point with the feeling that African students were being treated better than Chinese students. The Chinese government was trying to woo some of these African nations. They just gotten diplomatic immunity. And the Chinese students were expressing their displeasure. When Hu Yaobang died on April 15th, there was a real sense that this was a cause célèbre here. He was a reform-minded quasi-liberal leader. I guess at that time, the liberal leader was a relative term. But students were very upset. They felt as if the intellectuals did not have a chance when they graduated. Prices were too high. They weren't going to get good jobs when they graduated. If you didn't have connections, if you weren't corrupt, you couldn't really make it in the new China. And those were some of the grievances that they addressed. And it seemed for a time that authorities were being conciliatory and willing to listen to them. But as we know, things didn't turn out that well.
Okay. And Adi, the next question I'm going to direct at you. Why did the army have to be sent in to quell these protests, and were there not sort of provincial police or other forces who could deal with these protesters?
Yeah, well, the protests went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, and I think it's fair to say the whole world fell in love with the ideals of the student-led protests, at least initially. That included foreign correspondents, that included people watching on TV around the world, and it included the residents of Beijing, and that included security forces in Beijing. There was such a split in the top levels of the leadership that even the Communist Party at one point was encouraging people to take to the streets. So you had basically all of Beijing, in essence, was supporting kind of peaceful protests led by the students. I think and we know that the higher echelon of the leadership, they thought that Beijing security forces, even Beijing-based military, would not be up to the task of clearing the square and restoring order, and they actually made the decision to bring in the army and to bring in army units from all over the country, including some who had been isolated from news a couple weeks before the attack, just because they were really worried about soldiers being sympathetic to what was happening in Tiananmen Square.
Okay, Adi, we're going to stay with you for the next question. And so, since you were bureau chief in 1989, there were obviously protests and revolutions going on elsewhere in the world too. So our next question from a reader asks, was there any indication that the Chinese Communist Party at the time felt that these protests were large-scale enough that they could be a precursor to another revolution?
Well, if I understand the question, it's maybe could it be a precursor to something like the Cultural Revolution that happened in China? And yeah, I mean, Tiananmen was unusual in a lot of ways. It was the first big international event that was seen by the world on CNN to such an extent that we take for granted now. It was also one of the few events in China where we subsequently learned a lot about what was happening behind the scenes. We do know that when Deng Xiaoping, when his inner core of the top, mostly octogenarian leaders got together, they were explicitly comparing the Tiananmen movement of 1989 to the really destabilizing 10-year Cultural Revolution many years earlier. So, personally, the parallel would strike one as very facile. It was just the Cultural Revolution was really directed by the top leadership, by Mao. This was something that was, first of all, not calling for the overthrow of the regime, but also was a kind of a movement that was bubbling up. So I think the answer is yes. A lot of these guys who had lived through this calamitous cultural revolution, saw people in the streets, saw people protesting, saw students getting engaged, and said, oh my God, we could have another cultural revolution. Again, the parallel doesn't really seem that apt, but I think that was in the minds of the leadership.
Okay, and Adam and Addie, staying with you guys too. And a question from Twitter asks, did you ever feel at the time in June 1989 that you guys might also be attacked?
To some extent, yes. I mean, I was a kid at the time. I think I was just 20 years old, and I hadn't ever covered anything besides the Sewer Commission in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. So, you know, when you're standing in the middle of 10,000 people in front of the gates of Jungnanhai, and you get slammed against the gate because there's fear that there are plainclothes police there, you know, I never knew how to protect myself in a mob, and really, you know, had I toppled over, I think I would have been trampled. And then another time on the west side of the city, I went out there because there were all these rumors that trucks were rolling in, military trucks, and I think I got a little bit too close because the police were pushing me back and motioning me back, and that was the first time I was really scared.
Addie, anything to add?
I was never in any personal danger. Actually, I mean, this is an interesting footnote. On June 4th, you know, the actual June 3rd, June 4th, the actual massacre, I was in Hong Kong. My wife had just given birth to our first child, and I'd left Beijing, and I was in Hong Kong at that point. A lot of journalists, a lot of foreign correspondents had actually left China on June 2nd. And this is another interesting sort of historical note. There was a sense by the end of May, by early June, that the movement on the square was petering out. And it's true that a lot of the Beijing-based students who had occupied the square had decided to return to campus at that point. There were still students streaming in from other cities, sort of having their Tiananmen movement. You know, there were still people on the square. It was still an issue. But it was dying down. You know, it would have been rainy. A lot of journalists took that moment, end of May, even as late as June 2nd, to say, wow, finally, there's not much happening. I can finally take a break after covering the story 24/7 for weeks and weeks and weeks. What happened then is, you know, the night before the massacre, the government sent in unarmed troops, sort of basically hiking in, jogging in from the outskirts into the center of the city. They were unarmed. They didn't really seem to have a clear mission. They were stopped easily. What that achieved was all of Beijing was now on edge again. All of Beijing was in the streets again. The next night, the government came in with tanks, with AK-47s, with live ammunition. They put down a rebellion, but it was a rebellion that they had, in essence, created by sending in this odd group of unarmed troops the night before. You know, cynics would think at that point the government needed to put down a rebellion in order to settle the power struggle and to assert control. But it was a rebellion that you could argue it wasn't. I mean, it was there were people on the street because they had basically brought them out there by what they'd done the night before.
All right, the next question comes from Joyce Howe in Hong Kong, and Josh, I think me and you can tackle this one. Has China's bid to stamp out memories of June 4th succeeded among this generation? Josh, why don't you take it from a mainland China angle, and I'll speak a little bit about Hong Kong and Taiwan.
Sure. The situation in mainland Hong Kong, or mainland China rather, is a little bit difficult to suss out. Obviously, I mean, certainly there's a lot of information about the protests and the crackdown available online. You know, to people who have the know-how, who can circumvent the Great Firewall and other censorship measures that China has in place. There's plenty of information out there, and there's also when I was here as a student in the late 90s, there were copies of documentaries about Tiananmen sort of circulating amongst young people in Beijing. So there's certainly information there. How interested other young people are in actually accessing that information is another question. I think a lot of young people just they don't perceive politics to be an important part of their lives, and they're not sort of motivated to seek it out necessarily. So I mean, I think the number of who knows how many people really actually know about Tiananmen Square and about much in detail. I mean, the information's there if they want it, but the way China is these days, a lot of people I presume just aren't that interested.
So it is heartening for me, I guess, sitting here in Hong Kong, and we do see mainland students on exchange here and also in Taiwan, and people who are tourists who come here, and they do try and actively seek out that information, either about June 4th or about what's going on politically just on any day in China. So for example, today I went to the museum that's newly opened in Hong Kong, and there were definitely more mainland tourists there than usual. And a couple of them had said they came especially to Hong Kong on this day to come and visit this museum. So the knowledge is definitely there. It's just, I guess it's a small part of China, and also what they do with that knowledge when they go back to China. My guess is that, well, they probably don't do very much with that, given the threats that hang over their heads of, if they try to disseminate that kind of information. And kind of related to that question, the next one comes from Steve in DC, who asks, why do students in China today seem less politically interested or engaged than they were 25 years ago? And I'm going to open this up to the floor, but Josh, how about you take this, because I think you spend a lot of time speaking to young people as part of your reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I mean, I don't know if it may seem like they are less politically engaged than they were 25 years ago, and in some senses they definitely are. I think, there was sort of a bargain struck in some ways after Tiananmen Square with students and with China and the Chinese population in general, where the government sort of, basically said, we're going to provide a stable, fairly quickly growing economy. You guys can all sort of get, wealthy and live higher, enjoy higher standards of living, and then, leave the politics to us. And I think you do have some of that on university campuses. I think people are really just concerned about employment, about getting jobs, about improving their sort of material lives, because that's the path that's open to them. I mean, that said, I do think there is a strain of political interest and activism on university campuses. I just think it's not as obvious as it was 25 years ago.
Adam, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just one quick point. I taught a group of graduate students at Hong Kong University. They were all studying business journalism, and half of the 40 students were from the mainland. And I would say that, the way that they're educated is you don't sort of talk too much in class. You don't show your cards. But, in individual conversations throughout the semester, I think they're just as politically engaged as, and maybe even more than Western students I've met. They just kind of keep the cards close to the chest, because there's no upside in talking about what you want changed when you can't change it.
Okay, and we only have time for one more question. What are some of the lessons learned by the Chinese Communist Party post-Tiananmen on how they should best clamp down on dissent and placate the population? Josh, why don't you round it off for us?
Well, like I was just saying earlier, I mean, I think part of, the sort of big move that they made, the big decision that they made post Tiananmen Square was to really, I mean, it took a few years for them to get around to this until 1992 or so, was to really bear down and push economic growth and make that the central focus of the Communist Party's efforts, because that's, I mean, nothing placates a population better than sort of rising standards of living, which is what a lot of the protesters were wanted in 1989. As far as dissidents goes, they've clearly, the lesson they've taken from 1989 is that they never want to see dissidents, political criticism rise to that level ever again. And so they've developed a very, very sophisticated, multi-layered approach to sort of monitoring, weeding out dissidents, keeping them isolated. Even extends to NGOs. They want to make sure that no level of criticism of the government goes nationwide, the way the student protest basically did in 1989. So everything is kept very localized. There are local complaints. It's fine to protest something that's happening in your backyard, a petrochemical plant that you don't like. That's fine. But as soon as you start to go national, then the government sweeps in, and they've grown very, very efficient at keeping people from gathering the way they did in 1989.
Great, thank you, Josh, for that response. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for today on this Google Hangout. And you can watch a replay of this on the Wall Street Journal Digital Network. I'm Isabella Sager, and I'm signing off here in Hong Kong, where in about half an hour, a vigil in memory of the Tiananmen crackdown will be taking place. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right.